Welcome to Purim 2025. So we have some instructions.
Oh.
This is a story that started, well, we started it last night, right? In Genesis, when we talked about Amalek, right? The grandson of Esau. And then we talked about Agag, who Saul was supposed to, well, the Amalekites came out to the children of Israel after they went through the Red Sea and annihilated the stragglers, right? They weren't kind, and God said, I'm going to come after you every year, right? Okay, no peeking back there in the corners. No peeking, no peeking. And then we learned that Saul was supposed to kill Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and he disobeyed, right? Brought us all the way up to where we are. So, anytime you hear the name Haman, so you get to pick. We got noisemakers, we got clapping hands, we've got more noisemakers, we have clickers. Well, maybe we have clickers. All right, so grab your weapon against anti-Semitism. That's all right. All right, we got clappers. What do you want, Charlie? Or you want a clicker? What do you want?
What do you want?
You want this? Clippers and clappers and. Woo. Okay. You want the clicker? Okay. All right. Okay.
When she says Haman.
Only when you hear Haman. Yeah. Okay. Good job. All right.
You want Papa else?
No.
I got your horn.
You want your horn?
You want your horn?
Here we go.
You want a tray?
These events took place in the time of Ashurbanipal, or whatever you say his name. That king. The one over Persia and Media. The one who got rid of Vashti. The one who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. It was in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Shushan, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, that he gave a banquet for all of his officials and countries and courtiers, and the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and the provincial officers and the officials were all in attendance, and he displays dazzling wealth. And then he asked for the queen, but she wouldn't come. And he asked his advisors what should be done, but the queen, Vashti, refusing to come. And according to the law, they said, what we should do to Queen Vashti, since she didn't obey the order of King Ahasuerus, that dude, he conveyed what should happen. Well, Vashti, the queen, has wronged not only the king, but also all the officials. And all the peoples in all the provinces, they will hear this act of the queen, and it will become known to all the women, who will then start showing disrespect toward their own husbands. And they will say, oh, but that king, he ordered Vashti, the queen, to be brought before him, but she wouldn't come. And moreover, the noble ladies of Persia and Media, who hear of the queen's conduct, will mention it to all the king's officials, and it will bring about no end of disrespect. So let it be written, so that the laws of the Persians and the Medes, which are irrevocable, that Vashti is never again to be admitted into the presence of King, that one. And that the king give her royal position to someone better than she. And when the edict made by the king is proclaimed throughout the length and breadth of the kingdom, then all the wives will honor their husbands. And the king did as suggested. Our text today is taken straight from the book of Esther. Out of the complete Jewish Bible version. Okay? All right. A while later, when King Ahasuerus' anger had subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. And the king's servants attending him said, a search should be made for young, good-looking virgins, and the king should appoint officials in all the provinces of the kingdom to gather all the young, good-looking virgins to the house of the harem in Shushan, the capital, and they should be put under the care of Haggai, the king's officer in charge of the women, and he should give them the cosmetics they require. And then the girl who seems best to the king should become queen instead of Vashti. This proposal pleased the king, so he acted accordingly. Now there was in Shushan, the capital, a man who was a Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. And he had been exiled, from the tribe of Saul, the king. He had been exiled from Jerusalem with the captives, exiled with the king of Yehudah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, had carried off. And he had raised Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, because she had neither father nor mother. And the girl was shapely and good-looking. After her father and mother's death, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's order and decree were proclaimed and many girls assembled in Shushan, the capital, under the care of Haggai, Esther too was taken into the king's house and put under the care of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. And the girl pleased him and won his favor. So he lost no time in giving her cosmetics and her portions of special food, and 7 girls from the king's palace to attend her. He also promoted her, and the girls attending her, to the best place in the harem's quarters. Esther did not disclose her people or her family ties, because Mordecai had instructed her not to tell anyone. Every day, Mordecai would walk around in front of the courtyard of the harem's house in order to know how Esther was doing and what was happening to each girl. Each girl had their turn to appear before King Ahasuerus, and after she had undergone the full 12-month preparation period prescribed for the women, 6 months treatment with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics, then when the girl went to see the king, whatever she wanted would be given to her as she went from the harem's house to the king's palace. And she would go in the evening, and the following day should be returned to another part of the harem's house, and she would not go to the king again unless he summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Achaziah, whom Mordecai had adopted as his own daughter, to appear before the king, she didn't ask for anything other than what Haggai, the king's officer in charge of the harem, advised. Yet Esther was admired by all who saw her. She was brought to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, during the 7th year of his reign. The king liked Esther more than all of his other wives. None of the other virgins obtained such favor and approval from him. So he put a royal crown on her head, and he made her queen in place of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet in Esther's honor. For all his officers and servants decreed a holiday for the provinces and distributed gifts worthy of royal bounty. When the girls would gather on other occasions, Mordecai would sit at the king's gate. Esther had not yet revealed her family ties or her people, as Mordecai had ordered her. For Esther continued obeying what Mordecai had told her to do, as she had when he was raising her. On one of those occasions, two of the officers, when Mordecai was sitting at the gate, two of the king's officers, Bigtan and Teresh, from the group in charge of the private entryways, became angry, and they conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. But Mordecai learned about it and told Queen Esther, and Esther reported it to the king, crediting Mordecai. The matter was investigated, found to be true, and both were hanged on the stake. All this was recorded in the daily journal that was kept with the king. Sometime later, King Ahasuerus, you know that king, began to single out Haman, the son of Hammedatha. Began to single out Haman. Eventually, he gave him precedence over all his fellow officers. All the king's servants at the king's gate would kneel and bow down before Haman, because the king had so ordered. But Mordecai would neither kneel nor bow down. The king's servants at the king's gates asked Mordecai, "Why don't you obey the king's order?" But after they had confronted him a number of times, without his paying attention to them, they told Haman in order to find out whether Mordecai's explanation that he was a Jew would suffice to justify his behavior. Haman was furious when he saw that Mordecai was not kneeling and bowing down to him. However, on learning what people Mordecai belonged to, it seemed to him a waste to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Rather, he decided to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole of, that king, his kingdom. In the first month, the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of that king, they began throwing pur, that is, casting lots, before Haman. Every day and every month until the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to Ahasuerus, "There is a particular people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people. Moreover, they don't observe the king's laws. It doesn't befit the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, have a decree written for destruction, and I will hand over 330 tons of silver to the officials in charge of the king's affairs to deposit in the royal treasury." The king then took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman. Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agag, the enemy of the Jews. And then the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, and the people too. Do with it as seems good to you." The king's secretaries were summoned on the 13th day of the first month. They wrote down all Haman's orders to the king's armies, commanders, and the governors in all the provinces, and to all the officials of every people, to each province in his own script, and to each his own people. And they sealed it with the king's signet ring, and letters were sent by courier. And on the 12th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, they were to seize all the goods and the plunder of the Jews, from young to old, including small children and women. So a copy of the document was issued And it was sent. And at the king's order, all the runners went out quickly, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the capital. Then the king and Haman sat down for a drink together. But the city of Shushan was thrown into confusion. When Mordecai learned everything that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out through the city, lamenting and crying bitterly. He stopped before entering the king's gate, since no one was allowed to go inside the king's gate wearing sackcloth. In every province reached by the king's order and decree, there was great mourning among the Jews. There was great mourning, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, as many lay down on sackcloth and ashes. When the girls and the officials attending Esther came and informed her of this, the queen became greatly distressed. She sent clothes to Mordecai to wear, and instead of sackcloth, but he wouldn't accept them. So Esther summoned Hatak, one of the king's officials, attending her, and instructed him to go to Mordecai and find out, what is this all about, and why? Hatak went out to Mordecai in the open space in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, exactly how much silver, etc., 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 etc. And he also gave him a copy of the decree for the destruction issued in Shushan, so that he could show it to Esther and explain it to her, and then instruct her to approach the king, intercede with him, and implore his favor on behalf of the people. And Hatak returned and told Esther what Mordecai had said, and then Esther spoke to Hatak and gave him this message. All the king's officials and all the people know that if anyone, man or woman, approaches the king, and he must be put to death. There's only one law, unless the king holds out the gold scepter. I haven't been summoned. Upon being told, Esther said, Mordecai asked him to give Esther this answer. Don't suppose that merely because you happen to be in the royal palace, that you will escape any more than any other Jew. For if you fail to speak up now, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from a different direction. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows whether you didn't come into your royal position precisely for such a time as this? Then Esther had them return this answer to Mordecai. Go assemble all the Jews to Founder Shushan. Have them fast for me, neither eating nor drinking, for 3 days and 3 nights. And I and my girls, we will fast the same. Then I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Then Mordecai went his way and did everything Esther had ordered him to do. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace, opposite the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne. Okay. The baby shark is done dancing. There was a baby shark in Persian, just so you know. Oh. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace, opposite of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the king's hall, across from the entrance to the hall. And when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the courtyard, she won his favor. So the king extended the gold scepter in his hand toward Esther. And Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. "What is it you want, Queen Esther?" the king asked. "Whatever your request, up to half my kingdom, it will be given to you." "Well, if it's all right with the king," answered Esther, "let the king and Haman come today to the banquet I prepared." And then the king said, "Bring Haman!" Quickly, so that what Esther has asked for can be done. So the king and Haman came to the banquet Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king again asked Esther, "Whatever you request, you will be granted. Whatever you want, up to half the kingdom, it will be done." And then answered, "My request, what I want is this. If I have one favor, in the king's favor, if it pleases the king to grant my request and to do what I want, let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I prepare for them tomorrow, and I will do as the king has said." That day, Haman went out happy and in good spirits. But when Haman saw at the gate, that he neither rose nor moved for him, Haman was infuriated with Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Haman restrained himself and went home. About his vast wealth, his many sons, and everything constructed with how the king had promoted him and given him precedence over the other officials and the servants' king. Indeed, Haman said, Esther the queen let nobody into the banquet with the king except for me. And tomorrow I'm invited by her again, together with the king. Yet none of this does me any good at all as long as I keep seeing that Mordecai the Jew remain seated at the king's gate. At this, Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, "Have a gallows hung 75 feet high, constructed, and in the morning speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on it. Then go in and enjoy yourself with the king at the banquet." Haman liked the idea, so he had a gallows made. Technical error. That night, the king couldn't sleep, so he ordered the records be brought in of the daily journal, and they were read to the king. It was found that Mordecai had told all about Bigtana and Teresh, two of the king's officers from the group in charge of the private entryways, who had conspired to assassinate the king. And he asked what honor or distinction was conferred on Mordecai for this. And the king's servant said, nothing was done for him. Then the king asked, who's that in the courtyard? Because Haman had come into the outer courtyard of the king's palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared for him. The king's servants told him, it's Haman. Standing in the courtyard. And the king said, have him come in. So Haman came in. And the king said to him, what should be done for a man that the king wants to honor? So Haman thought to himself. And he answered the king, who would he want to honor more than me? So he answered, for a man the king wants to honor have royal robes brought, which the king himself wears, and the horse the king himself rides on, with a royal crown on its head.
Oh yeah, let's go. Yeah.
The robes and the horse should be handed over to one of the king's most respected officials. And they should put the robes on the man the king wants to honor and lead him on horseback through the streets of the city, proclaiming ahead of him, this is what is done for the man who the king wants to honor. And so the king said to Haman, hurry and take the robes and the horse, as you said, and do it for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Don't leave anything out that you have mentioned.
Dang it.
So Haman took the robes and the horse and dressed Mordecai. And led him riding through the streets of the city as he proclaimed ahead of him,
Hear ye, the king has chosen this guy. Not me.
Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, and Haman rushed home with his So the narrator lost her place. After Haman had told the rest, his wife and all his friends, everything that had happened to him, his advisors and his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall as a Jew, you will not get the better of him. On the contrary, your downfall is certain. And while they were still talking with him, the king's officials came, hurrying to bring Haman the banquet that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And the king said, whatever you request, Queen Esther, you will be granted it. Whatever you want up to half the kingdom, it will be done. And Queen Esther said, if I have won your favor, if it pleases the king, let what I ask be given to me for the lives of my people. For we have been sold, and I and my people are to be destroyed, killed, exterminated. If we have only been sold as mere men and women slaves, I would remain silent, since then our trouble would not have been worth the damage it would have caused to the king. King Ashurbanipal, he said, that king. He asked Esther the queen, who is he? Who is the man who dare do such a thing? Esther said, a ruthless enemy. It's this wicked Haman. Haman stood aghast, terrified before the king and the queen, and in a rage, the king got up from the wine banquet and went out to the palace garden. But Haman remained, pleading with Esther the queen to spare his life, for he could see that the king had decided to do to him. And Haman had just fallen on the couch where Esther was when the king returned from the palace garden to the wine banquet. and he shouted, "Is he going to make the queen here in the palace before my very eyes?" This moment these words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Havarana, or whoever he is, one of the king's attendants said, "Look, the gallows 75 feet high for that Haman made." For Mordecai, who spoke only good for the king, is standing at Haman's house. And the king said, "Hang him on it."
No!
Again, Esther spoke to the king. She fell at his feet and begged him with tears to put an end to the mischief. Haman and Agag. Haman, the Agag, had caused by the scheme he had worked out against the Jews. And the king extended the gold scepter toward Esther. So Esther got up and stood in front of the king. And she said, "If it pleases the king, if I have one favor, if the matter seems right to the king, and if I have his approval, then let an order be written rescinding the letters devised by Haman the son of..." Be written rescinding the letters devised by Haman the son. She wrote to destroy the Jews in all the provinces. For how can I bear the disaster that will overcome my people? King Ahasuerus said to Esther the queen and Mordecai the Jew, "Listen, I've given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows. I've given the house of and they hanged him on the gallows because he threatened the lives of the Jews. You should issue a decree in the king's name for whatever you want, and seal it with the king's signet ring. Because a decree written by the king's name and sealed with the king's ring cannot be rescinded." The king's secretaries were summoned at the time, on the 23rd day of the 3rd month of Sivan, and a decree was written, and they were sent to the 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, also the Jews in their script. They wrote in the name of the king, and they sealed it with the king's signet ring, and they sent the letters by couriers and on horseback, riding fast horses used in the king's service, bred from royal stock. And the letter said that the king had also granted Jews in every city the right to assemble and defend their lives by destroying and killing and exterminating any forces of any people or province that would attack them, their little ones, or their women, or would try to seize their good. A copy of the edict was to be issued as a decree in every province and proclaimed to all the peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance against their enemies. Meanwhile, Mordecai left the king's presence arrayed in royal blue and white, wearing a large gold crown and a robe of 5 linen, purple, and the city of Shushan shouted for joy. For the Jews, all was life and gladness, joy and honor in every province. And the city where the king's order and decree arrived, the Jews and gladness and a joy, a feast and a holiday, many from the peoples of the land became Jews because of fear the Jews had overcome them. The time approached for the king's order and a decree to be carried out, but the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped for to overpower them, but instead it turned out the opposite took place. And Mordecai continued to grow increasingly. The Jews put all their enemies to the sword, and there was great slaughter and destruction as they did whatever they wanted to those who hated them. That same day, after the king had been told the number of those killed in Shushan, the capital, he said to Queen Esther, "If the Jews have done this in Shushan, imagine what they've done elsewhere." So the king ordered these things done. And then it was ordered that the events be written. This is why Jews of the villages who live in unwalled towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a day for celebrating and rejoicing, a holiday and a time for sending each other portions of food. Mordecai recorded the events and sent letters to all the Jews. both far and near, instructing them to observe the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day every year to commemorate the days on which the Jews obtained rest from their enemies, the wicked Haman. So the Jews took it upon themselves to continue what they had already begun to do. And they crushed. Esther came before the king. He ordered by letters that the wicked Haman's wicked scheme, which he had plotted against the Jews, should recoil on his own head. This is why these days are called Purim, after the word pur, to cast lots. Thus, because of everything written in this letter, and what they had seen concerning this matter and what had come upon them, the Jews resolved and took upon themselves their descendants and all who might join them, that without fail they would observe these 2 days in accordance with what was written in this letter. And they said, to which they said,
They
they
tried.
tried to kill us. Let's eat.
We won.
Let's eat.
We won.
Okay.
No. Go ahead, husband. Go ahead, husband.
Take a bow, youngins. Take a bow. Take a bow. Okay, so did you see the correlation between Amalek and the Agite and King Saul, right? And Esau's grandson and Saul's disobedience? Did you also see that Mordecai and Esther were descendants of Kish, the Benjamite? Who was Kish the Benjamite's famous son? King Saul, the one who disobeyed. You see how all that turns around? You know how that turns around? All right. So, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Shalom.